Let's talk about hotkeys. Hotkeys are very important when you're working in any program, in my opinion. Hotkeys allow you to very quickly navigate to the tools that you want and keep focused on your work instead of worrying about the interface. And this is especially true when you're sculpting in ZBrush. I'm a big advocate for learning the hotkeys as soon as possible and utilizing them, especially for your favorite brushes. So here you'll see, as I press the numbers on my keyboard, watch my brush menu here. I have hotkeys set for my 5 favorite brushes. Now, I was trained as a sculptor and a painter, and I spent years in traditional media, and consistently, everyone I know, including myself, we'd have hundreds and hundreds of dollars worth of paintbrushes and sculpting tools, but 5 that we actually used. And I think that's true for just about everyone, and it's also true in ZBrush. You press the B key to bring up the brush menu, and you've got all these different brushes, and they're all very, very useful. But I think you'll find there's about 5 that you'll constantly go to. I do about 90% of everything that I sculpt and paint with the same 5 brushes, and those brushes are the Move brush, the Standard brush, the Inflate brush, the Clay Tubes brush. Now, not Clay Buildup. I'm often asked if I use Clay Buildup, but I use Clay Tubes because it's more subtle than Clay Buildup. The Damn Standard brush, and I've recently added a 6th brush, Trim Dynamic. Now, these are just on the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. As I press these, I switch between my brushes. So this allows me to very, very quickly be working on my model. Let's say, for example, I Alt-click on the head, so I've got the head subtool selected. So let me go ahead and go to my subtool menu here, make sure the head is selected. It is, so I'll just press Shift-D, maybe step down a couple subdivision levels, and maybe I'll press W, or press the number 1 key for move, and I can start moving the mesh here. Maybe I'll press 4, and then I've got the Clay Tubes brush. I'll change my alpha, and then I'll start sculpting here. Change back to the Move brush with the number 1, and I can make changes here. So you see, I'm not having to go over here and change things. I don't have to press this B hotkey and then press the contextual hotkeys. I'm able to just very, very quickly move between my brushes as I need them. And that's very, very valuable. So how do we set up custom hotkeys? Well, luckily it's very, very simple in ZBrush. If we wanted to hotkey our favorite brushes, what we need to do, anytime we set a hotkey in ZBrush, simply press Control and Alt and then click on any menu item. For example, if I press Control Alt and click on Switch Color. Now you'll see the tooltip tells me this already has a hotkey assigned to it. It's the letter V. So anytime you already have a hotkey, it will tell you that hotkey in the tooltip. So let's say, for example, I go to Expose. That's Shift X. Switch color is V. If I want to change or add an hotkey, Control, Alt, click on that object, and then in the upper screen there you see it says press any key combination to assign a custom hotkey or escape. So any button I press now, if I set this to, let's say, H, this says it's already assigned to another interface item, but we'll just go ahead and click OK. So now if I press the H key, it will switch my color. So let's say that we want to hotkey our favorite brushes. Now, do not fall into this trap where you hotkey this button here, because that's not the actual brush, that is the brush palette. If we want to hotkey our brushes, we need to open up the brush menu and then tear it off by clicking the radial icon here. Now, this is the brush palette icon, and all these smaller buttons here, these are actually the brushes themselves. And you're only going to see in this menu those brushes that you've most recently selected. So what I will do before I hotkey any brushes is I just manually select them. So let's say I wanted to select the Move brush. I would press B for brush, M for move, and then press the V hotkey for the Move brush. Standard is B for brush, S for standard, and then you can see that that is the the G hotkey. If I wanted to do inflate, B for brush, I for inflate, and then inflate is the N hotkey. B for brush, C for clay, and select Clay Tubes, which is T. Again, I don't use Clay Buildup. A lot of people ask me when I say I use Clay Tubes why I don't use Clay Buildup. The reason for that is the Clay Buildup brush is very aggressive. So if I select the Clay Tubes brush and I use Clay Tubes, you see it's you know, there's some subtlety to it, and that's with a very, very high Z intensity. If I turn that Z intensity down, I can be even more subtle. However, if I select Clay Buildup, this is an extremely aggressive brush. It just keeps building up as I as I apply it, which has its uses, but for general sculpting of form, I think it's far too aggressive. So we've got clay tubes. The next brush that we want is dam standard. B for brush, D for dam, and then dam standard is there. So you see, as I'm selecting these brushes, they appear over here in this menu. So if I want to hotkey them, I will simply press Control, Alt, and then I will click on the brush I want to hotkey. In this case, move. It asks me to press a custom hotkey, and I'll select the number 1. Just press the number 1, and that will be assigned. Number 2, I will assign to the standard brush. So Control, Alt, click on standard, and then press the number 2. The next brush that I want is inflate. Control, Alt, click on inflate, and press the number 3. Clay tubes, I will set to the number 4. Control, Alt, click on clay tubes, and press 4. And then dam standard, I set to the number 5. So now if I press 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you see my brush selection will change. Now this is only going to be for this particular instance of ZBrush. If I close ZBrush and reopen, those hotkeys will reset. So if I want to save these so they're there every time I start ZBrush, I go to the Preferences menu and I open up Hotkeys here. And then just click Store, and that will store a startup hotkeys file. So that means every time ZBrush starts, it looks at the startup hotkeys and then we'll apply those to the ZBrush session. So they will be there every time I start. So let's take a look now at a different application of hotkeys. Here I've loaded up a generic polysphere, and I'll just use Control-D to add a couple subdivision levels. Then I'll press the 5 hotkey, which we just set for the dam standard brush. Now, what I like to do is when I'm creating a stroke, you see that this dam standard stroke is quite deep. Perhaps I don't want it to be quite so intense. I turn down my Z intensity, and it's still not quite what I want. What's very handy is if I turn down my Z intensity and then I make a stroke on the model, if I go to the stroke menu under modifiers, there's a button here called replay last. If I click that button, it replays my last stroke for each time I click it. So what this allows me to do is it allows me to use a very subtle brush, create a stroke, and then use stroke replay last to replay that last stroke and build up the surface detail that I want. Now I use this all the time when I'm detailing with alphas, when I'm painting. It has a variety of different applications, and I have a hotkey set for it. ZBrush has a default hotkey, but I reset the default hotkey by going to Stroke, Control-Alt clicking on Replay Last, and then setting that to Alt-1. So now if I draw a stroke on the model, and then don't move it, press Alt-1 multiple times, it will replay that stroke. Now, if I were to move the model and then replay stroke, it's going to repeat that movement. So make sure that you do your stroke, and then before you do anything else, replay it. So let's undo back to our surface. So this is a neat use of it here as well. If I go to the standard brush, change to a drag rectangle stroke, change to alpha 6, and let's click and drag. So we're creating a corneal bulge and an eyeball, and I'll just replay that stroke one more time, and that gives me a nice corneal bulge. Now I'm not going to move this tool. I will duplicate it. Make sure solo is turned on so I'm not seeing the other subtool. I am going to turn on Z sub, turn my Z intensity up, and I will replay that stroke again. And you see it starts to recess. So now what I've done is I've created the concavity of the iris, which goes inside the sphere of the eye, with the same stroke I used to create the convexity of the corneal bulge. So now I've got two subtools for an eye. I've got the cornea and the sclera with the recess for the iris. So basically you can replay strokes between subtools or models. They're not dependent on the model that you're on. You can replay them on other Z tools. As long as it's the last stroke, you can replay it. Any stroke at all. If I rotate and then replay stroke, it's going to replay that stroke, but you see it lands on top of the model. If I were to click and drag here and then replay stroke, it just replays that same stroke. So it replays that rotating stroke. Let's say I want to rotate something ever so slightly, replay stroke. I can do sort of incremental rotations around an object like this. So it's very nice to have that replay stroke set to a hotkey. And again, you can hotkey any item in the ZBrush interface just by Control-Alt clicking on it and then selecting your hotkey. Save your hotkeys by going to the Preferences menu, go to Hotkeys and store them, or save out a separate file, which I highly recommend. I have my hotkeys saved in a file that I keep backed up in case I ever need to load them up manually. So that concludes this look at hotkeys inside of ZBrush and how to set them up ourselves. We'll talk a little bit more about hotkeys in interface customization, where we will create our own custom menus and then use hotkeys to invoke floating menus like this one here. But that's sort of beyond this introductory video just on the concept of hotkeys themselves. So I hope you've enjoyed watching, and I will see you in the next video.